I'm CJ Werleman, and this is episode number 29 of Foreign Object. I'm excited. Why? This promises to be either the best or worst episode of Foreign Object ever. Why? I've just stepped off a long-haul flight from Tel Aviv to Los Angeles, and my guest has done likewise from Istanbul. Either our collective jet lag and disorientation will somehow bring the best from each of us, or more likely, for you listeners, it might be akin to eavesdropping a conversation between two fools high on the horse tranquilizer ketamine. But I remain forever the optimist, and I'm optimistic that this conversation is going to be a great one. Then there's much to talk about, especially when it comes to the Middle East. ISIS has taken Ramadi and further territory in Syria. The most right-wing government in Israel history has now formed, and Saudi Arabia continues its bombing campaign in Yemen, and a humanitarian crisis is unfolding there, like the one that has emerged in Iraq, Syria, Gaza, and Libya. Egypt's military dictatorship has handed down a death sentence to the country's first democratically elected leader, and here in America, the surveillance and harassment of Muslims continues unabated. To help me decipher all this and more is the very insightful Wajahat Ali. Wajahat is a writer and co-host of Al Jazeera America's social media-driven talk show, The Stream. He is the author of the play The Domestic Crusaders and lead author of the investigative report Fear Inc., The Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America. Several weeks ago, he took part in a debate alongside my previous guest, Linda Sarsour. Wajahat, welcome to Foreign Object, mate.
Hey, thanks. I'm trying to stave off this horse tranquilizer I'm on, but either, I like it. Either go big or go home. Either this will be the best or the worst. So we're going to be extremists today, apparently, CJ. I like it.
Well, we'll start off. We'll start off with an extremist question. I mean, Al Jazeera sounds like Al Nusra and Al Qaeda. So, are you working for a terrorist organization?
Oh, when I was looking at my career options, I was wondering, I'm a licensed attorney. I've done some good work here in D.C. with think tanks. I wrote a play. What should I do next? And I'm like, you know what? How to moderate myself in America? Let's go join a terrorist organization. So that was on the high list of priorities of how to be a successful moderate Muslim American. It's the sixth plan on the Muslim agenda, and it's number 5 or number 6 to join a quote unquote extremist terrorist organization. No, look, I'm using humor, of course, dry humor.
Of course,
it's ridiculous, but unfortunately, your question reflects a lot of the ignorance and fear and sentiment of a portion of America that assumes that anything that is quote-unquote mainstream, quote-unquote Muslim or Arab, even though we're not really Muslim or Arab, we're Al Jazeera America. Somehow that is, your being is somehow fundamentally un-American or anti-American. And it's this type of sentiment, an exaggerated fear, hatred, and hysteria towards Islam and Muslims that has, I think, been perpetuated not only after 9/11, but specifically in the past 5 years, I would say. It's kind of reached a fever pitch. And we see this type of casual scapegoating, a lumping, if you will, right? This lumping of anything that is Middle Eastern or Arab, even though most Arab Americans, as you know, are actually not Muslim, they're Christian. This inelegant lumping of the Middle East with somehow Muslim, with somehow Hamas, with somehow Hamas, with somehow Hezbollah, with Al Jazeera. It's silly, but that's kind of the environment, as you know, CJ, we're living in, and it requires a type of, I think, sophisticated, informed commentary and empowerment of sophisticated, nuanced, informed narratives and storytellers to help dispel that. Not be an apologist or a propagandist, but honestly to, just try to veer this conversation towards moderation. I think honesty. Right now, it's a kind of a surreal comedy without the laugh track.
Yeah, let's talk about his atmosphere. All jokes aside, and that question had an element of truth to it. The NSA did spy on Al Jazeera, right?
I don't know if, I don't know if it did or did not, but Al Jazeera, as a network, as you know, going back to the Iraq War, we have been targeted literally by missiles and gunfire. The second Iraq War, a needless engagement predicated upon faulty information. It was Al Jazeera offices that were bombarded. Even when the Gaza crisis, the war, if you will, in the summer, as you can clearly see, Al Jazeera journalists and offices are targeted. Even here in America, when it came to Ferguson, we saw that it was our reporters who were doing nothing wrong, setting up location to cover the Ferguson protests, tear gas happened to affect Al Jazeera reporters. So there seems to be, wherever Al Jazeera is, there seems to be a target, unfortunately, on our back, and especially on our journalists and our headquarters. It's something that unfortunately has put our journalists in harm's way. And it does go to the point where you were saying in the beginning, you're using humor there, tongue-in-cheek, this kind of connotation of Al Jazeera with quote-unquote extremism, or Al Jazeera with radicalization. It's something, especially as we've entered the American market in the last 2 years, there is a segment in America that is deliberately fanning these types of flames. And it's something, though, CJ, I've been with the network for 2 years. You win them one show at a time, you win them one tweet at a time, and oftentimes it isn't what I'd say a malicious hatred, it's ignorance, and I think that's important. I think a lot of Americans, they just simply don't know any better, right? So when it comes to Muslims, like 60% of Americans say they don't know a Muslim, even though Muslims have been here since like the 1500s, the first ones coming here from West Africa. And what I've seen the past few years is once you quite literally give them a new narrative, you give them a shot, and you invite those guests who are initially very hostile, they come on and say, oh, you guys were fair, you guys were balanced, unlike some other networks, you guys treated us with respect, and you guys gave us a fresh perspective. We didn't know any better.
I mean, it's interesting. You say that it's become worse in the last 5 years, so that the further we're getting away from 9/11, the atmospherics for anti-Muslim bigotry is becoming worse. So what is fueling that dynamic, you think? Is it I mean, you've written in Fear Inc. You've articulated and identified very clearly, the millionaires who are funding Islamophobic industry. Is it a case of special interests now, like the Israeli lobby and weapons manufacturers and big oil and anyone attached to the Imperial Project is now seizing upon that anti-Muslim hysteria in the public to further their special interests? Is it a case of money fueling this, or is it their inert bigotry which is being tapped in?
Ooh, big thesis question there, CJ. Let me try to articulate it concisely if I can. To answer your question, yes, it is a concentrated effort. In 2011, in the summer, we released Fear Incorporated, The Roots of the Islamophobia Network, and a 6-month investigative report that I led, produced by the Center for American Progress, who aren't Arab, who aren't Muslim. They're a think tank in America. It was funded by American money because there was this a fear about this rise of anti-Muslim bigotry that not only threatened our national security, but also threatened our civil liberties and our national values of pluralism. And specifically what we saw and we investigated was there was not only money, but also special interests of a few interconnected, incestuous group of people, right? We broke down the Islamophobia industry in 5 groups. First is the money trail. We traced about 43 million over the period of 2001 to 2009 that predominantly went to what we call the Islamophobia Nerve Center, think tanks and quote-unquote scholars, mostly based out of DC, who have promoted these memes that went from the fringe now to the mainstream. I'll list a few. President Obama is a Muslim. Traditional Islam is radical Islam. No practicing Muslim can be a loyal American because Islam is antithetical to Western values. Mosques are Trojan horses that house radical Islam. And of course, Sharia is a threat to America. In 2008, 2009.
Also the Eurabian conspiracy.
Oh, yeah, and that's the European, Europe will become Eurabia by 2050. There is a demographic time bomb of anti-Western Muslims. And if we don't check them, they will overrun us, like the orcs. So these memes were on the fringe in 2009. And as we saw, even now, nearly every single Republican presidential candidate of 2012, and you've already seen it happening with South Carolina, this happened a couple of weeks ago, they're running on these anti-Muslim memes, specifically Sharia is a threat to America. Now, these memes go from the think tanks to the third group, which is these grassroots anti-Muslim groups that essentially spread it vis-a-vis their local organizations, and certain news channels who aren't fair and balanced, radio stations, and finally these memes that we've traced, quite literally, from think tank documents, such as Sharia is a threat to America, quite literally are copy-pasted in the mouths of political players. So again, in 2012, nearly every single Republican presidential candidate ran on the anti-Sharia platform, except Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, however, said he would not have a Muslim in his advisory board or his council. Awesome. And Sharia, I will just quickly say, this whole concept of Sharia as a threat to America has been debunked repeatedly by every single respected attorney, such as the American Bar Association, even the ACLU, They said, number one, it's based on misunderstanding and misinformation. And number two, they have said it's based purely on an anti-Muslim bias. And in the report, we trace quite literally how this extremist fringe meme went from quite literally the margins of American society to now a major talking point for exactly what you said, to drive both money and to drive political votes.
So who are the specific beneficiaries?
The specific beneficiaries of this, I think, are politicians, number one. For example, Bobby Jindal, the governor of Louisiana, knows better. He's smart. But he repeated an outdated, laughed-at meme by Steve Emerson, one of the major players of the Islamophobia network, who got laughed at by Dave Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK, when just a couple of months ago, Steve Emerson said that there are no-go zones now in Birmingham, where apparently Muslims have overrun, like the orcs, these cities, and now they've overrun it with their brand of Sharia that makes it hostile to non-Muslims. Cameron apparently choked on his porridge, so it's good to know that he eats porridge, and said that was idiotic and ridiculous, and called out Steve Emerson. Now, you would assume moderate, intelligent people would say, you know what, this is a fringe meme, we shouldn't repeat it. Bobby Jindal, a week later, actually repeats it and says there are no-go zones where? In America. And apparently, he says this, and what does he do? He courts his base. And apparently he does it very deliberately, courting his base. So does Lindsey Graham, courting his base. So does Rick Santorum. So does now who else? Mike Huckabee. All of these people now who have thrown their hat in the ring for presidential candidacy for the Republican Party. And so it really pays for, number one, politicians. It also pays for people, some of the funders, not all of them, who have, if you will, an anti-Muslim, anti-Arab agenda based on what they perceive is a zero-sum mindset when it comes to the security of Israel. Now, not all the funders are Jewish Americans, but some of them are. You just have to follow the money. Number three, it's what we call the evangelical Christian, a radical, kind of this radical right-wing movement, which believes that, of course, that Muslims inherently are a threat to America and, of course, to Christian values. People like Franklin Graham, people like Pat Robertson, people like Kufi, right? Christians United for Israel, Pastor Hagee. Then you also see people who I think have an ideological agenda. People like Bridget Gabriel, Lebanese Christian. People like Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, co-founders of the hate group Stop Islamization of America, called out as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, called out even by the Anti-Defamation League as having an anti-Muslim agenda, and even called out for their hate by Britain when they wanted to go to Great Britain to join a conference by the EDL. Labor Secretary intervened and said, you will not be coming to this country because of your hate. So we see, again, and also finally, the last point, CJ, is Islamophobia industry is a lucrative industry. Every single person that I mentioned is a person who we called out in Fear Inc. makes a six-figure salary, including Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy, which is a think tank in DC that has been the preeminent leader in some of these memes, such as this whole Sharia threat. It came out of Center for Security Policy's document in 2010, Sharia, a Threat to America. And the attorney of Center for Security Policy, who also happens to be the attorney of Pamela Geller, look how incestuous this is David Yerushalmi, an attorney who the ADL calls out for an anti-immigrant, anti-black, anti-Muslim agenda. He is the co-author of Sharia, Threat to America, and he is also the author of the anti-Sharia legislation, which is now in 34 states, has passed in 6. So we get to see the ideological roots of these people, CJ. And speaking about foreign policy and speaking about how this relates to cross-Atlantic narratives, we go back to Europe. One of the worst terror threats that has happened in Europe, you know what it is. In 2000 summer, what happened in Norway? Anders Breivik, self-proclaimed crusader, Christian conservative, killed 77 people, leaves a bomb outside of a federal building that kills 8, then dresses up as a policeman, goes to the Utoya Island, takes a machine gun and a pistol, systematically kills 69 young adults, youth members of a youth labor movement who were having a summer retreat at the Utoya Island, kills 77 people. Now, for your listeners at home, Anders Breivik leaves behind a 1,500-page manifesto, very clearly articulating why he did what he did. It goes back to the point you made. He wants to warn and punish Europe, he says, for being too lenient to multiculturalism and Muslim immigration. He warns of what? Eurabia. These Muslim hordes overtake Europe, And specifically, in his 1,500-page manifesto, he cites all of the members that I've just mentioned, all the people I've mentioned, all the people that were noted in Fear Inc. Mark Sageman, a counterterrorism expert, reviews his 1,500-page manifesto and says the following, and I'll end on this point. He says that just as we follow the ideological roots of radicalized extremists, right, such as Nidal Hassan Malik, who shot 13 people in Fort Hood, we trace his ideology to Anwar Awlaki, the spokesman of Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula. He goes, we can't blame Pamela Gellers and Frank Gaffney's and Daniel Pipes for causing the violence. However, Anders Breivik emerges from their same ideological infrastructure, number one. And he says, number two, this rhetoric is not cost-free. So we see the poisonous aspects of this rhetoric eroding our civil liberties in America, seeing us quite literally turn our neighbors who happen to be Muslims or Muslimi, CJ, not even Muslims, but those Muslimi. Yeah. We're dividing each other along religious and ethnic lines, and we also see this feeding the extremist narrative of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because the number one recruitment and propaganda of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, as you know, is the what? The West is at war with Islam. And as we see, what did Pamela Geller and Geert Wilders say when there was the shooting at the Garland, Texas cartoon drawing? She said, what? This is war. And what did Geert Wilders say? This is war. Not against radical Islam. He said this is war against Islam. So extremism begets extremism. It feeds this narrative.
Symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship, and the world gets caught in the fire that they're producing.
Yeah, I mean, it's the extremes on both sides are the ones who hog the debate, because the media likes, flashy sounding noise. And I mean, you said, I think, during your debate in Brooklyn a few weeks ago, that these extremes, one is at war with the West and one is at war with Islam. As an American Muslim, you've never met neither.
Yeah. I always joke is apparently when I go to Muslim majority countries, I'm told that the West is at war with Islam, and when I'm here, apparently Islam is at war with the West. And this whole time I'm asking who is the West and who is Islam, because I've met neither. And if any of them asked me out for a date, they probably wouldn't pay for the bill. So it's a ridiculous framing of absolutism, simplicity, this categorization of these complex, nuanced identities and communities. The most diverse country in America is what? America. And the most diverse religious community in America is Muslims. So as an American Muslim of Pakistani descent, and of course, CJ, nothing says like an American Muslim of Pakistani descent, but as an American Muslim of Pakistani descent, I am like quite literally in 2015 in this post 9/11 world at the fault lines of this debate. I am both us and them, if you quite literally think about it.
Yeah.
And it is an opportunity, I think, that I think as a person of good conscience and a person who has the privilege of being placed in this situation, whether I like it or not, of helping, bridge this divides and quite hopefully take us towards moderation. But it is also quite exhausting. It is exhausting.
Do you think we're changing minds? In my darkest moments, and when I wallow in self-pity, and I've been beaten to death by the trolls on Twitter and online, I wonder if we are changing minds. You seem more optimistic than I am.
I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because I have to be optimistic, and I have to appeal to the best natures of both America and Islam, and whatever that means. I have to appeal to the best aspect of Americans and Muslim values. And I think there's an opportunity for us to emerge as the best version of ourselves and to exercise restraint when there are others who quite recklessly are fanning the flames of, I think, hysteria and bigotry. Look, the negative aspects are true. Let me talk about the negative, and I'll move to the positive.
Sure.
We're looking at 2015. To go back to what you said, if George W. Bush was running for presidential candidate in 2016, you know why he wouldn't get the nomination? He'd be seen as too pro-Muslim. Because after 9/11, and we have to give one credit to the Bush administration, because of the people that he employed, there was actually very nuanced, I think, respectful messaging about Islam and Muslims after 9/11. If you go back and look at Bush's speeches, and I think as a commander-in-chief, that top-down narrative helped to moderate, I think, much of the Republican response to Muslims and Islam. Now, you look at 2015, I've already gone through it, the public opinion about Islam is lower now than it was when it came to October 2011. Let that just sink in for your listeners.
Yep.
Number two, there's 5 times as many hate crimes against Muslims now than it was after 9/11. Mm-hmm. There are 50 nationwide protests against mosques. much more so than existed after 9/11. You see, again, nearly candidate and even elected officials such as Bobby Jindal running on a very concentrated anti-Muslim platform. Uh, and you see, this worrying trend. Even tomorrow, Friday, it's going to be May 29th. You see armed biker gangs making a call on Facebook to go with their guns and protest outside of a mosque in Arizona. Why? Because two of the shooters allegedly frequented that mosque. So they are defending free speech by taking their guns in a mass group and quite literally surrounding a mosque of innocent, practitioners who are going for their weekly prayers. I don't think that is quote unquote moral, nor do I think it's the wisest use of your free speech. But we see this happening, and we see people who, again, would not be taken seriously in any way, shape, or form. People like Frank Gaffney, people like Bridget Gabriel, people like Daniel Pipes, people like Steve Emerson. These memes that I've mentioned that would be laughed at are now entering the mainstream space. So yes, there is a worrying trend. Another worrying trend is you see Muslim, American girls who just wear the hijab, teenagers who go to high school, who are being quite literally, you see an uptick in bullying. You see also an uptick in employment discrimination against those who appear Muslimi or look Muslimi and have Muslimi sounding names. When I was growing up, the worst thing that I ever got called was Gandhi, which is actually a freaking compliment if you think about it.
Yeah.
So if this is a worrying trend,
Yeah.
right? And I want to go back to your listeners at home. If you're worried about national security, and you mentioned surveillance, some of the, if you will, hysterical responses to a legitimate threat of violent extremism, taken into context, of course, is mass surveillance in Muslim communities, racial profiling, Sharia bills. It is, number one, according to our law enforcement, ineffective. Number two, it's misinformed. And number three, it's counterproductive. So quite literally, this overreaction to a threat that has to be taken in context is actually made safe. And again, it fuels the number one propaganda and recruitment tool of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which is what? The West is at war with Islam. Just like extremists here cherry pick the worst aspects of Muslim majority nations, they too deliberately, very intentionally, in a sophisticated way, cherry pick the worst aspects of American quote-unquote culture. So that's what's threatening. What's good, though, is, look, after 9/11, and I've been in this space, it would be hard to find non-Muslim messengers who would carry our water, who would step up and say, you know what? What's happening against Muslims and Arabs and those who look Muslimly, this is a remake. This has happened before in American history. It's the same, literally, CJ, I have researched this for past 4 years. People listening at home might not take this seriously. Just give me a moment.
Sure.
The DNA of what's happening right now, the DNA is exactly similar to what happened against Catholics and against Jews and against Japanese American. You don't even have to go to the 19th century. You don't even have to go to Europe, 20th century. It's the same exact memes, just replace Muslim with Catholic. The same exact fears, replace Jew with Muslim. And it's a remake, and the characters, the boogeyman this time, happen to be Muslim. And the research supports it. And I think what's positive, are we making a dent? Yes, because I think Americans finally are like, you know what? Enough is enough. Usually the American narrative has a reset button where people wake up and say, hey, this is fundamentally against our values. This is poisoning the communal well. And we quite literally have Batman, who has no reason whatsoever to use any equity on Bill Maher, stand up and say, you know what? I don't know. I think this is whack. We have Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, who, again, no reason to have any equity, who actually are the only ones who quite literally challenged Ayan Hirsi Ali and her anti-Muslim narrative. You have people, interfaith communities who have stood up. And I think this is a shift. And secondly, when it comes to people like us, whether or not we wasted our lives by not becoming doctors and engineers, what you and I have noticed is vis-a-vis social media in particular, mainstream media is forced to reconcile the plurality of voices that challenge these toxic caricature narratives. We see more American Muslims. We see more Arab Americans. You mentioned Linda Sarsour. Maybe I'm doing something. Fareed Zakaria. You see Ayman on MSNBC. Yourself. People on mainstream media, people whose faces get shown, people who write blogs, who are taken seriously and forced to take seriously to contend with these multiplicity of narratives that quite deliberately challenge and debunk much of the fringe narratives that were, unchallenged. And I think this is I think what's really encouraging, and this is a sore point of Muslims, and I call Muslims out. I think I've been very fair. If you have a majority of Muslim Americans being doctors, engineers, and businessmen, and then you have a lot of Muslim uncles, I'm calling my own community out, drinking chai or eating hummus and yelling at Bill O'Reilly from the comfort of their suburban homes, you have spectators instead of participants. And you need participants to throw down. What do you need? You need to out-satire them. You out-debate them. You outthink them. You throw down in the ring, and you see a model. This happened before the Jews. This happened before the Catholics. Yes, there are unique challenges that we face, but it is a remake. And I say this specifically to empower American Muslims and Arab Americans and those who look Muslimly so they don't have despair. The worst thing that will ever happen is if we see this young generation of millennials say, you know what, I tap out, I throw my towel in the ring. No matter what happens, America's gonna hate us. No matter what happens, I'm gonna be an outsider. No matter what happens, no one's gonna care about my narrative. That is the worst thing that could happen to America. Is if you see a minority-majority community and communities rise up and say, you know what, we have no voice and we have no space, and become dejected. Instead, if you see these models of success, tangible models of success, and if they, I think, are elevated, it gives hope to this young generation that says, you know what, this guy on horse tranquilizer named Wajahat Ali, and this goofy-ass guy named CJ with an Australian accent, if these guys are taken seriously, maybe, just maybe, there's hope for us and there's hope for America.
I think satire is so important, and I mean that's why Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert are so effective, and you do it well. And Dean Obadiah, who's a friend of mine, he's also been on Foreign Object. I mean, great guy, and when you can get people to laugh at a narrative, it highlights how stupid and moronic and base that narrative is. And it's such a undervalued tool, and I don't think it's used enough. So I mean, you're contributing to that greatly. So a question I had when you were speaking, and I wanted to raise this with you, is so what's your take then on these non-Muslim, non-Middle Eastern Westerners who are demanding and urging for a reformation of Islam?
Oh yeah, look. Okay, so you alluded to it. About 2 weeks ago, I participated on a panel held at BAM, Brooklyn. Music Center. It was supposed to be Islamophobia conversation, a quote unquote conversation, seeing how we could take this conversation towards the middle. It was myself, Linda Sarsour, Bassem, Yusuf, for those of you who know, called the Jon Stewart of The Daily Show, a journalist, Asra Nomani, Douglas Murray of UK, and also it was supposed to be Ayan Hirsi Ali, who at the last second dropped out. Now, the people you mentioned as reformers, one of them is Ayan Hirsi Ali. This is my problem with these so-called reformers. I refer to them as this kind of infotainment circus that in a sane world, you would laugh at them quite literally as a Monty Python sketch or an SNL sketch without the laugh track. Because here we are in modern day America where non-experts on Islam, people who have literally no understanding of Islam, fiqh, Arabic, who quite literally have proudly say that they're excommunicated from Muslim communities. So they actually don't even engage with the Muslims they're allegedly trying to reform. They have no traction with Muslim communities. They have no legitimacy with Muslim communities. They have no authenticity with Muslim communities. And when they speak consistently, they hold Muslims and Islam with utter contempt, right? These types of people now are promoted within mainstream circles, given mainstream appointments, given very lucrative book deals, giving fellowships at respected universities like Harvard, or sometimes at very powerful conservative think tanks like the AEI, and are given high figures to speak about Islam and Muslims. So it's almost like hey, we're going to talk about reformation in African American communities. Let's have Wajahat Ali lead the charge. Or let's talk about reformation about Catholicism. Let's have Wajahat Ali, a practicing Muslim who has no scholarship on Catholicism, but went to an all-boys Catholic high school, Bellarmine, where he got the highest grade, by the way, every semester in religious studies. Have him be the leading voice, right? And I think, as you can clearly see, I'm using some humor here. Anyone who's listening to this would be like, why are we listening to these people be the reformers? Now, I think what's very troubling is I think these so-called reformers are actually part of the solution. are actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. Let's take the case of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example. Ayaan Hirsi Ali repeatedly and consistently has called for a war on Islam, a civilizational war on Islam, not just radical Islam, on Islam. She has compared Islam to a nihilistic cult of death. She has compared Islam to Nazism. She has called for a banning and closing of Muslim schools. All right. So when we talk about enlightenment and secularism and freedom, I don't think these reflect those values. She has also been called out repeatedly for lying on her asylum application that she used to get into the Netherlands, and which she peddled as a very sympathetic narrative to eventually become an elected official when it came to Netherlands parliament and political parties. And specifically, she lied about her narrative. She said, her family threatened her with honor killing, which they didn't. She said her husband threatened her, which he didn't. Her own family has gone against her. These lies came out in 2006, 2007 that forced an immense crisis in the Netherlands and forced her to quite literally resign. And then where did she find shelter, CJ? At AEI, American Enterprise Institute.
They're a conservative think tank.
Yeah, a conservative think tank which has promoted vis-a-vis some of its members much of these memes, such as Sharia as a threat to America. And now she's come out with a book where apparently she has, without any expertise, mind you, on Islam, on Islamic history, on Muslims. And again, when she quite literally has no authenticity or engagement with Muslims, has come up with a plan to reform Islam. Again, anyone listening to this would be like, why are we taking this person seriously? Why are we investing time in a person whom she quite literally holds Muslims and Islam in contempt and quite literally says she does not engage with Muslims? And her entire audience is who? Non-Muslims. So she has been giving a platform both internationally and nationally. And she just got a huge platform on Fox News that did a fawning portrait of her and Asra Nomani and Zudi Jasser. Again, individuals, some of them called out in Fear Inc., who have worked in tandem with anti-Muslim bigots promoting these memes, who have no legitimacy in Muslim communities. Her reformation is, she takes 1.7 billion Muslims, the most diverse religious communities in America and across the world, and categorizes them in three groups: Mecca Muslim, Medina Muslim, and modifier Muslim. Most Muslims have never been to Mecca and Medina. I myself am a Bay Area Muslim with a Virginia zip code and a Pakistani attitude. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's silly.
Yeah.
And just for your listeners at home, just replace this with Jews, replace this with Catholics. No one would take this seriously. And these so-called reformers go unchallenged, CJ. That's the thing. If you just look at their history, if you look at Ayaan's history, any serious journalist who would have her on, just challenge her according to her own quotes. No one does that. Challenge Sam Harris to his own quotes. He's pro-torture, a man for enlightenment and secularism and freedom. He's pro-racial profiling, not only just of Muslims, those who look Muslimy, those who aren't even Muslim. He's pro-racial profiling. He is for a civilizational war with Islam. Who would take these people seriously? No one. But based on the climate that we're in, this type of fringe, ridiculous, inflammatory comments are unchallenged and taken as serious, authentic, informed commentary and seen as the worst of the worst intellectualism. And that's what's sad.
Well, the people who take him seriously are white suburbanites who have never been overseas.
I mean, white. You're right. Not just whites. It's not your token caricature of a rabid anti-Muslim, or those who espouse Muslim bigotry. It's also those who quote unquote fancy themselves as liberal intellectuals, those who fancy themselves as quote unquote sophisticated and nuanced and worldly. That's what's very troubling. Those people in particular should know better. If you, again, and I keep saying this, if you want to do a thought experiment at home, if you have 5 minutes, take all the quotes that Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Sam Harris, Douglas Murray have said about Islam and Muslims and just replace it with Jew and Judaism, replace it with Catholic and Catholicism, and go back and review 20th century American history. Don't even go to Europe. Don't even go to 19th century. Just copy, paste, and remove. And you will see the exact same playbook, the exact same DNA. And I've always said this, these types of hate mongers, these types of people who engage in inflammatory rhetoric, these types of people who divide us against religious and ethnic lines, what happens to them, CJ? They always end up as the villains of our children's history books. But unfortunately, right now, there is a cost to such rhetoric. The cost is being borne by the most marginalized of societies, not just Muslims, but also those who look Muslimly, and also when it comes to our national security. There's a cost to this.
And I mean, and it's that the cost is that we'll pay is exactly what ISIS wants. They want us to marginalise and alienate and ostracize, these communities, and that's, they feed on that despair and that
Look,
dislocation.
what did Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number one of Al Qaeda, say? Half of the battlefield, half of the war, is fought on this particular battlefield. Where? The media. That's Ayman al-Zawahiri, which is actually now receding, when it comes to ISIS, when it comes to winning the hearts and minds vis-a-vis social media and the media battleground of, those who are disaffected. So even Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda, and even ISIS recognize that when it comes to this quote-unquote war, half of the battleground that you have to win is the media. And quite literally, they cherry pick all of this. They wait for it, right? They wait for Abu Ghraib torture. They wait for mosque protests. They wait for, Muhammad cartoon controversy. I'll give you an example. 2010. Let's take it to Pam Geller and the Stop Islamization of America, and pretty much every single person that we called out in Fear Inc. They manufactured a non-controversy over the Ground Zero mosque protest, which was neither at Ground Zero nor a mosque, leading up right before the midterm 2010 elections. As you remember, in the spring, it started in the late spring, and it ended up culminating into international controversy. As a result of that, Pastor Jones, a nobody with a handlebar mustache and a congregation of like 15 in Florida, said, if you Muslims don't move that Ground Zero mosque, I'm going to burn the Quran. You remember that happened in 2010?
Sure.
Okay. General Petraeus, CJ, before he was known for, some scandals and emails, was the highest ranking commander who was doing some important work in Central Asia, takes a time out and sends an email to AP saying, listen, this type of inflammatory rhetoric, this type of inflammatory sentiment actually threatens our troops and threatens our security. I would urge moderation, right? Now, what happens in 2011? Pastor Jones carries out his threat, burns the Quran, and then what happens just a few weeks afterwards? Extremists in Afghanistan do what? They attack the UN compound, killing nearly a dozen. And what they said was the reason and justification: look, the West is at war with Islam, they burn the Quran. I'm just giving you one example. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Anders Breivik, look, 1,500-page manifesto, ideological infrastructure, the same thing that emerged from what? These Islamophobes that we mentioned in Fear Inc. The West, the Islam is at war with the West. Europe is becoming Eurabia. The threat of Islamization, we have to punish them and we have to warn against it. And now look, tomorrow, May 29th, what's happening in Arizona? The armed biker movement in response to what? Pamela Geller's Garland, Texas, Draw Muhammad cartoon protest, which, by the way, we should mention, was ignored by every single Muslim community in Texas. They deliberately, all of them, all of the leaders, all of the mainstream organizations said, guys, we're going to proactively ignore. Stay at home, have a barbecue, eat some hummus. The best response is ignoring it. So all these people who say, oh, we're using our free speech to fight against these Muslim radicals. What radicals? 99.99% of American Muslims are, quote-unquote, moderate, peaceful. Muslim Americans help law enforcement more than any other community in America. 40% of violent extremist plots were thwarted due to Muslim American help. And this is really interesting, CJ. A lot of people don't know this. MI5 did a audit, a thorough, if you will, investigation of suicide bombers or radicals and extremists about 3 or 4 years ago. What they found out is that most of these people who join Al-Qaeda, and you can even say ISIS, are religious novices. They don't have a strong religious literacy. They don't have strong religious practice. In fact, as we've seen, most of the people joining ISIS, they Google and buy Islam for Dummies book. Okay. What they also find out, number two, and this was really fascinating, and a lot of people don't talk about, is that MI5, the intelligence agency, found that those Muslims who have strong religious tradition, religious literacy, and a religious identity are actually part of the solution, not part of the problem. And what they also found out is that that is one of the best ways of staving off radicalization. In America,
Mark Sageman found exactly the same thing. When every single suicide terrorist, and every would-be suicide terrorist attacker, and every terrorist that he interviewed found that their religious literacy was so low. And in fact, his final recommendation at the end of his study was, maybe the greatest tool for de-radicalization might be correct Islamic interpretation of the Quran.
That's what MI5 said. And, you know,
Yeah.
when you mentioned Mark Sageman in his book, Leaderless Jihad, he, in his same study, only 20% of the people that joined, he said, had any understanding of traditional Islam. Only 20%. Olivier Roy, let's go to France. French scholar who's followed this, said the same thing. And furthermore, he says, you know, religious practice or religious identity or even religiosity does not lead to violent extremism. It is one of the factors, but it's not the sole factor. If you go to America and cross the Atlantic, a MAPO study done in 2009 find that when it comes to religious identity and mosque participation, strong religious identity and engaged mosque participation led to more civic engagement in America. And what's also interesting, when I told you all those amazing stats about American Muslims, which if you really think about it, American Muslims are actually a success story. They have fulfilled the American dream.
Well, they were at the door of whiteness pre 9/11.
Many of them are, not all of them, but yeah, many of them. But what's really interesting is American Muslims are far more religious and religiously affiliated and religiously identified than European Muslims. In fact, American Muslims at a similar percentage, for about 46 to 47%, identify with a religious identity similar to Christian Americans. For evangelical Americans, it goes up to 79%. So you have strongly religious American Muslims who are more religious than European Muslims, who, by the way, are 99.99% moderate, who do not join ISIS or Al-Qaeda, who reject violent extremism, who work with law enforcement, who completely, by their very existence, deflate, defang, and destroy this ridiculous notion and stereotype that religious Muslims equals anti-American Muslims, that religion equals extremism, and that traditional Islam equals violent extremism. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. So my question to that is no one's going to believe, anyone who's not on our side, not on this side of the argument, and the side of the argument we're presenting is weighed down heavily with empirical data and facts. But the right wing, the conservative, neoconservative, this new atheist, this Christian right narrative, is the one which dominates still mainstream thought. It's certainly what dominates mainstream media. So the question I keep asking myself is, how long are we going to stay absolutely fucked in the head over 9/11? Because you think about it, Pearl Harbor was 1941. My grandfather was a prisoner of war in Changi on the Burma Railway and in the coal mines in Japan. And then my dad was born in 41, and he was in an internment camp in Indonesia under the control of the Japanese. Well, when that war ended, I was 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Nobody was acting crazy about Japanese, and the same can be said about communism and also Nazism. But how many years are we going to act deranged in this PTSD-like coma post 9/11?
No, you ask a very good question. I want to tackle the last thing you said first because it brought up a point. You said act deranged. What's really interesting is a deliberate strategy of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and even terrorism is to use, especially ISIS, to use extreme sensationalist violence, even though in context it happens in minor amounts compared to other violence, such as like gun violence, right? To provoke fear in the hearts of quote-unquote enemies, to portray excessive strength and project more strength than they actually have, to appeal to those who are deranged enough to follow them. But also, CJ, what people fail to realize is to provoke an overreaction by the West. And like you said, a deranged overreaction. And specifically this type of sensationalized violence that is caused by violent extremists that we've seen in the past 14 years, I think, provoke this type of hysteria and this type of fear. Now, it goes back to just human psychology. You have a higher chance of being killed by a soda machine falling on you than a domestic terror threat. You have a higher chance of falling off a bed or furniture than being killed by a domestic terror threat. The number one domestic terror threat, according to FBI, is the Sovereign Citizens Movement, a radical right-wing anti-government group. However, when it comes to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the type of violence they use, the beheading, the kidnapping, the two planes in the World Towers, right, is a sensationalized, almost cinematic, if you will, a type of articulation of violence that it's seared into our consciousness. Okay, when you marry that with predominant ignorance Okay, because the two root causes of Islamophobia, according to our research, are the following. The two root causes: ignorance, lack of knowledge and information, and number two, the media. So when 60% of Americans don't know a Muslim and don't know Islam, but what they do get about Islam and Muslims and Muslim majority nations is a sensationalized, repeated, consistent view of anarchy, discord, tumult, right? Burqas, beheadings, and so forth. When that's married together, the image of the quote-unquote Muslim, compared to other groups, is a national security threat. I'll give you an example. Like LGBT, they went through a lot, still going through a lot. But once, when we were growing up, what was the worst image? Ew, perverted. Ew, gross. When they look at Muslims, it's like, this guy might kill me. And so this national security threat is this flight or flight response, this emotional response that causes a deranged overreaction hysteria. The way to combat that, I think, and people laugh at me, but the research shows this might be true, and I've been saying it for years. Don't laugh at me now. Is storytelling.
Yeah.
If you don't throw down and tell your story will be told. We need more proactive storytelling in the field, not only of culture, not only of law enforcement, not only of legality, not only of foreign policy, but we need a multicultural justice league, a coalition of the willing. People who are united in shared values, reclaiming the American narrative and the Muslim narrative, both here and abroad. You need, like I said before, participants willing to throw down and challenge these toxic narratives. It also, of course, requires many other, it's a multiple front. You need better education. You need better textbooks. You need better interfaith policies so groups work together in tandem. You need better storytellers when it comes to culture, when it comes to quote-unquote propaganda, when it comes to mass media. You need, specific legal cases that I think smart lawyers and smart legal communities and activists jump on, that, quite literally, like, every minority community jumps on a specific case, if you will, a legal case. You need some of those cases that calls out racial profiling, that calls out mass surveillance, that calls out bigotry, that calls out employment discrimination. You need strength in numbers. You need political advocacy. You need smarter people running at local, state, and federal levels being elected. You also need, and you know this, and I know this, better foreign policy. That's something that the government never wants to tackle. One of the root causes, unfortunately, of radicalization is what? Foreign policy. You need also an empowered Muslim majority community which has the ability to thrive, which has the ability to actually have hope, which has the ability to be economically empowered. Look at Muslim majority nations right now, dictatorships, autocrats, theocracies, right? Do you see what I'm saying? You need a tandem approach, and I think it's happening. It'll take time. We still live in a post 9/11 world. Look, CJ, I would love for this to be over, right? I thought maybe after 10 years after 9/11, we'd finally move into a post 9/11 world, but we're not.
No.
9/11 is seared into the collective consciousness. I think for our generation and maybe the millennial generation, there is a fork in the timeline. There'll always be a pre-9/11, there'll always be a post 9/11. And for American Muslims and Islam, the sad part is our utility and our value is anchored in the national security stasis. What does that mean? You can only be a good Muslim if you're helping national security, and if you're either, God forbid, silent or against it, you are what? A bad Muslim. And I think that's the challenge of my generation, our generation of storytellers, to quite literally create healthier narratives, and also when it comes to these toxic narratives, identify them, out them, expose them. Go ahead and say, celebrate your free speech and say what you want to say. But just like we give the space to the Ku Klux Klan to say their hate, what we do as a mainstream society is say, we recognize your right to say what you say, but we don't give you the megaphone. We don't give you a platform. We sideline you to the margins where you belong. And then we tell our children that this is exactly what's the worst values of America, and this is how we should not be. And that's what we should do for the anti-Muslim bigots. And I hope I was able to give you some roadmap. You asked me a thesis question, but hopefully that's somewhat helpful.
Mate, that's spot on. It's incredible how when we talk about ending the war on terror, the debate in this country seems absolutely confined to discussing whether or not we should call it radical Islam or something else. And that's it. You cannot end the war on terror without, number one, solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can't end the war on terror without solving these autocratic, dictatorships like Sisi's government or Assad's regime. And the crumbling up of the disintegration of Iraq. Until you solve these these political problems, and includes Saudi Arabia in that as well, you can't end a war on terror. But nobody says that because a lot of these states are our allies. So it's such a disingenuous argument to begin with. So, I mean, you've stated that very clearly. I just don't get why there's people aren't saying the same thing on CNN or Fox News, or when we know why they don't say it there, or MSNBC even.
Yeah, you and I can't change foreign policy, unfortunately. We just can't. We can call it out.
Yeah.
And you and I can, unfortunately, change the heavy-handed dictatorships that unfortunately exist in many Muslim majority countries, the corruption, the double standards, the attack on minorities. But we can do our part. And I think we can at least inform, we can at least hopefully enlighten, and we can at least change the stories. And I think it takes time, but it's a multi-pronged effort. See, it's just not going to be storytelling. No. It just won't be culture. It just won't be elected officials. It just won't be educators. It just won't be activists. It just won't be lawyers. It's going to be all of us. And then hopefully it requires also some sane policy initiatives from both Muslim majority countries and America, both domestically and internationally. And then hopefully, look, this is the reality, CJ. You know this and I know this. The world is now a battlefield. I think for the rest of our lives and maybe our children's lives, we're going to be engaged in asymmetrical warfare, right? The rules have changed. Nation states probably won't be the ones engaging in the majority of these conflicts. You're going to see lone radicals. You're going to see people using media and technology. You're going to see new forms of recruitment, new forms of weaponry. And it seems, what happened in Copenhagen, what happened unfortunately in France, what happened in Australia, what happened in Garland, Texas, it's probably going to be the norm, But, you went back to, are we going to be demented and hysterical in how we respond to it? Or are we going to be measured, sophisticated, smart, and intelligent in how we tackle it? And if we actually are measured, informed, and smart, and intelligent, and effective in how we tackle very legitimate national security threats, and and how we actually embrace and deal with our minorities in America, and specifically how we embrace and include minorities as we embark on a minority-majority country, that in itself, I think, will dictate the future of America. And I honestly believe that will dictate if America can achieve the American dream in the 21st century, if this evolving, messy, rough draft can become and achieve the America that it was destined to be. And if we fail in how we deal with our most marginalized, how we deal with our minority, how we deal with our beleaguered communities, I think we will fail. And I think that's when the extremists win.
Mate, this has been brilliant, mate. It's you've covered so much, and you've really painted a really holistic picture in what needs to be done going forward, rather than just spouting talking points and the odd soundbite. So, mate, there's a lot of information to digest there for my listeners. Mate, I want to thank you. And just one thing I want to add to that: the storytelling. That is something you never hear anywhere for public consumption, and that is so important. And I believe that it's the storytelling which is enabled Israel to gain such a sympathetic ear in America, and the Palestinians have struggled with that, to articulate a really good story about their history, about their culture, about their traditions, and about their identity. And they've basically relied on victimhood rather than telling a good story. And I believe if they can come up with a better story rather than "we were here," then we might go a long way to becoming effective in challenging that. But mate, where can my listeners best find you? So because
so the best way to find me is, and look at this as a 21st century conversation, on Twitter. Find me at Wajahat Ali, WAJAHATALI. Also on Al Jazeera America. Also, I'm starting to write more finally, so keep your eye out on some articles that I've written. And I wrote one last week, which I think was amusing, and I think you might find amusing. It was my first New York Times piece. It's about I'm a moderate biker, and I think we were like 2 steps ahead. And it's told from the viewpoint of a quote-unquote moderate biker who laments the fact that his moderate biker people are being scapegoated. And for your listeners, you're pretty clever. You can tell why I did that satire.
Mate, that's awesome, Wajahat. Mate, thanks for being on Foreign Object, mate.
No, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. It's rare to have an intelligent, informed conversation.
Oh, no, it's good. You saved me from speaking to. I'm still trying to recover from my Xanax and wine-induced airline coma. So
basically, for all the listeners at home, always take horse tranquilizers before doing an interview.
Always.
Always. All right, man.
All right, mate. Have a good one. Talk to you soon. See you, mate. Bye-bye.